Over to you, Byron.
Esbon, Nan, John Wampus, Sylvanus Watto, an Indian boy of Holbrook's, an Indian girl of Mr. Dudley, Mariah, Pete, Thomas Beduna, Elizabeth Beduna,
Benjamin Beduna, Joseph Beduna, Abigail Beduna, Lydia Beduna, Ebenezer Beduna, Moses Beduna, Joaquin, Amos Hill, Simon Gosen, James Trusty,
Dan, Anthony, Brill, Jimmy, quote, a likely Negro woman, Flora, Sabby, Boston Jr., Caesar, Peter,
Dinah, Jeffrey, Bristol, Guinea, Phyllis, Guinea, Quam, Peter, Caesar,
Flora, Phyllis, Phyllis's child, quote, a Negro man, Sharper, Fortune, Guinea, Jonathan, Dinah, Keturah,
Phoebe, Susanna, Peter, Elizabeth, Simon, Tobias, quote, a Negro male child, mother of, quote, a Negro male child, Ishmael, Venus, Richard, quote, a Negro girl about 17 years of age,
Roxbury, Phyllis, Phyllis, Bristol, Cato, London, Phyllis, Prince, Phyllis, Cuffy, unknown, quote, a Negro man, unknown, Juba, Cuffy, Boston, Boston.
These are the names of 79 Black and Indigenous people connected with First Church Roxbury in its early days. 58 of these men, women, and children were enslaved by First Church Roxbury's white parishioners and shared in the report on enslavement by researcher Aabid Allibhai. These are lives you will hear more about this evening. I'm the Reverend Mary Margaret Earle, Executive Director and Senior Minister at the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry, housed at the First Church in Roxbury. Tonight, we are sharing work that grew out of, in part, our commitment that the Urban Ministry made in 2020 after the killing of George Floyd. We created a statement called We Speak Now, and it included specific actions because we wanted to hold ourselves accountable for what we were saying at that moment. Here is a portion from that statement. We speak now. As the United States and Greater Boston confront the painful consequence of systemic racism, the board of the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry stands as one to say this. Through the urban ministry's 190-year history, we have predominantly been led by people who are white, and our work framed by people with the privileges conferred by their whiteness, and we have not said enough. We were birthed in a nation and community built upon racism and white supremacy. The death of George Floyd tracks an unbroken line from slavery through lynching, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration. Systemic racism is baked into every single system of Greater Boston and in this nation: our courts, politics, transportation, environmental protections, healthcare, education, economy, and housing. And we have not said enough. We resolve to claim this opportunity to dismantle institutional racism. And we speak now. We commit to transform our historic Roxbury campus into a hub to serve the community of Roxbury. We will welcome artists and leaders speaking truth about our nation's history and use our historic meeting house to highlight Roxbury artists and speakers of color. We will interrogate the racial history of our inherited meeting house and investigate ways that First Church Roxbury and the urban ministry served and failed to serve people of color, and we will tell those multiple stories. Tonight, we take a concrete step forward in that commitment with the presentation of this very important report by Aabid Allibhai, a graduate student at Harvard's African American Studies program. We are honored to work with the Roxbury Historical Society on this report. This report this evening will be broken into two parts to give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask questions. And as you have questions, please feel free to put them into the question and answer box at the bottom of your screen. And now I am very proud to introduce a special guest this evening, the historian and Roxbury Historical Board member, Byron Rushing, who in his long public life has exemplified leaning into history to advance justice, and who has taught me personally so much about how to see the arc of history as a way of facing the present. Welcome, Byron.
Good evening, everyone. It is so good to be here. The Roxbury Historical Society is really privileged to have had this opportunity to work with First Church and the Unitarian Universalist Urban Ministry to develop this history. We are really graced by finding the researcher Aabid Allibhai, who is a graduate student at Harvard, and the Dorothy and Charles Harris Wesley Fellow at the W.B. Du Bois Research Institute, the Hutchins Center. And he is a PhD candidate in African and African American studies. We first met while he was researching Africans on the Shirley Estate in Roxbury in 18th century colonial Massachusetts for the Shirley Eustace House Association. This work was done as the association was preparing its application for Boston landmark status. The most complete published history of the First Church in Roxbury was Walter Elliott Thwing's History of the First Church in Roxbury, 1630 to 1904. Thwing noted 14 Negroes in its index. Aabid has found so far almost 80 African and indigenous human beings with connections to the First Church and its members, and of that, as you heard, at least 58 were enslaved. There are many directions to go in for us and for him in this work as we move on. I expected to learn a lot in this report. I was, though, surprised to read in the beginning of this report a poem by a 20th century African-American woman poet, and that is Lucille Clifton, who was the poet laureate of the state of Maryland, and was asked when the state of Maryland was celebrating its 350th anniversary of white people's arrival there, to write a poem celebrating their colonial heritage. And this is the poem she wrote. Why people be mad at me sometimes? They ask me to remember, but they want me to remember their memories. And I keep on remembering mine. And so as we go forward in reading this report, in discussing this report, let us not forget one thing. Know this, in the words of William Wilberforce near the close of his anti-slavery speech to the British Parliament in 1791, he said, having heard all of this, you may choose to look the other way, but you can never again say that you did not know.
Fast forward to Sunday's 30-second spot, a cool $7 million. So the biggest and probably the best thing for the
Aabid?
Thank you, Byron. I'm just going to, so I'm going to go for about 15 to 20 minutes. Then we're going to pause for a little questions answer session. And then I'm going to go for another 15 minutes. I'm just about to share my screen and then we can get started. Can folks see my screen?
Yes.
Yes, okay. I'd like to thank the Reverend Mary Margaret Earl, Byron Rushing, and Marcia Buttman, as well as all the folks at the UU Urban Ministry who worked to put this event together. I'd also like to thank everyone who has provided feedback on this report and all of you for attending today's talk. At least 58 human beings, Black and Indigenous men, women, and children were enslaved by First Church's white parishioners. That number, of course, is a significant undercount. The records do not tell us about everyone. A few, like Maria, burned to death for setting aflame her enslaver's house, have stories we can tell in some detail, but little is known of most. All faced the grueling horrors of chattel slavery. Their names are on screen. This report joins several others on Church's deep entanglement with slavery in and around Boston. I should stress that this report is merely an introduction to the history of slavery at the First Church in Roxbury. There is still more work to be done, more stories to be told. People of color in the First Church in Roxbury records. Unlike whites, people of color appeared in First Church in Roxbury records alongside a notation of their race. This practice, which reinforced the otherness of Black and Indigenous people and their Christianity, was universal among churches in colonial New England. When Nan, enslaved by First Church's parishioner, inaugural pastor Thomas Weld, passed away in 1646, the church simply noted that, quote, Nan, Mr. Weld's captive Indian, died, who was also hopeful, unquote. When an enslaved Black woman named Guinea was baptized, the church described her as, quote, Guinea Negro servant maid to Judge Dudley, unquote. At the First Church in Roxbury, there was one exception to the practice of recording the race of non-white people, the Bedunia family, whom the historian Gloria Whiting has written about at length. Thomas Bedunia was a free Black man who married and raised a family with a white woman named Lydia Craft in 1703. As marriages could be performed by either pastors or justices of the peace, the couple had multiple options in their hometown of Roxbury. They could approach First Church pastor Nehemiah Walter or one of the local justices of the peace, Paul Dudley or James Bailey. Instead, in what had been a cold, snowy October, they trudged to Boston, deciding to perform their nuptials at the residence of Justice of the Peace Samuel Sewall. Sewall had previously wed enslaved Black couples, and perhaps this was why Thomas and Lydia strategically chose to approach him instead of his Roxbury counterparts. While Black and white people had long engaged in sexual and romantic relationships, Thomas and Lydia appear to have been the first interracial couple in Massachusetts to request a formal marriage. In 1703, no legal prohibition existed against interracial marriage in Massachusetts, though 2 years after the Bedunias' marriage, the colonial legislature passed, quote, an act for the better preventing of a spurious and mixed issue. The act banned interracial marriages and added severe punishments for interracial fornication while securing the right of enslaved people to marry each other, though enslavers didn't necessarily respect this right. As their marriage was the only recorded interracial marriage in the colony before the law was passed, it is quite probable that colonial authorities enacted the new law, at least in part, in response to Thomas and Lydia's union. Judge Sewall wed the couple, but in an unusual decision, chose not to record Thomas Bedunia's race. Around the same time, someone, perhaps Sewall or a First Church member, noticed that Lydia became pregnant before she wed. The unknown person informed colonial authorities who had criminalized sex before marriage. Unlike Sewall, the Suffolk County Court that adjudicated the fornication charge in 1704 noted that Thomas was Black and Lydia was white. As the case was adjudicated before the passage of the 1705, quote, Act for the better preventing of a spurious and mixed issue, the court sentenced them to the same penalty they would give offenders of the same race. Thomas Bedunia was likely born in West Africa, stolen from his home and family, and survived the treacherous Middle Passage to the Americas before somehow managing to regain his freedom. One can surmise his origins from his name. No white colonist in Massachusetts was named Bedunia, and Badu was an Akan name sometimes given to the 10th born son of a family. As Whiting notes, Bedunia has a strong phonetic progenitor in a common West African given name, Badu or Bedua. The Akan are from present-day Ghana, what Europeans called the Gold Coast, after its major export. By the turn of the 18th century, enslaved people overtook gold as the region's major export, though the neighboring region, present-day Togo, Benin, and Nigeria, was already called the Slave Coast for its major export. Here's just a closer look at the Gold Coast and the Slave Coast. Thomas and Lydia Bedunia had 7 children together, some of whom are shown in the church records on screen. While Thomas does not appear in the First Church records, some of his multiracial children, or as colonial authorities refer to them, his quote, spurious and mixed issue, do appear, as they were, like their mother, baptized at the Roxbury Church. Like Sewall's recording of their father's marriage, First Church chose not to document the races of Thomas and Lydia's children who, like their father, would go on to marry white partners. At least one of the Bedunia children, Benjamin, rests in Roxbury's Elliott burial ground. His gravestone reads, quote, in memory of Benjamin Bedunia, who died the 25th day of August, AD 1771. The resting places of the other Bedunias and those of most Black people who died in colonial New England remain unknown. The graves of most colonial era Black people, especially those who were enslaved, are unmarked. Some had gravestones that are now lost. However, historian Caitlin Hopkins notes that most of New England's colonial era graveyards hold the bones of slaves, as most New England municipalities maintained unified burying places that segregated Black and white graves within a shared boundary. Surely then, many other people of African descent rest in Elliott burial ground. Segregated seating. The First Church in Roxbury, like all predominantly white churches in colonial New England, was interracial but segregated. Whites relegated people of color to the balconies or the back of the main floor of the church. On August 31st, 1741, First Church parishioners, quote, proposed whether the westerly corner of the meeting house be a place provided for ye Negroes to sit in, so as not to intrude on ye pews in the said west galleries, unquote. The vote, quote, passed in the affirmative. 6 decades later, in its direction for building the present fifth meeting house in 1804, the first church in Roxbury specified that, quote, there will be seats for the people of color above and back of the singers so as to occupy part of the tower. So here you can see in this slide a plan of the 1804 meeting house. This is the meeting house that still stands. This is the lower floor of the meeting house, and it's white only space. Black parishioners were not allowed to sit here, nor were Indigenous, any non-white parishioners were relegated to this red shaded area here. And what you're looking at now is the upper floor, the plan for the upper floor, and this rainbow-like figure that you can see right in front of the red shaded area. That's where the singers sat, and the people of color were relegated to the back, right at the back of the church, behind the singers. Even if racial segregation was not codified in writing, it was nevertheless the prevailing custom in New England churches, as was the case at NIMS Church in Litchfield, Connecticut. On one Sunday morning in 1764, 3 white youths arrived early at the Litchfield Church to find Nim, a Black man enslaved by one Colonel Ebenezer Marsh, sitting in a pew favored by one of the boys. Nim had been making a practice of sitting in this particular pew, the first pew from the southwest corner of the end gallery, to the great annoyance of white church members. The boy could have sat with Nim in the pew's empty seats, but sharing a pew with a Black man was unacceptable to him and other white congregants. Unlike the first church in Roxbury, the Litchfield Church apparently never held a formal vote on racial segregation. However, several white church members complained that Nim was violating a long-standing custom of racial segregation. Accordingly, some white congregants found Nim's conduct to be, quote, indecent and unbecoming, unquote, and protested that it was, quote, very insolent for Black people and slaves to sit in any pews by custom and usage appropriated to the use of white people, unquote. Several church members complained to Nim's enslaver, Colonel Marsh, who, in disapproval of Nim's, quote, such irregular and indecent conduct, strictly charged and forbade Nim from sitting in said pew, unquote. Unsatisfied with the colonel's reprimand, some church members installed an iron instrument on the pew's door to lock it shut. Nim, however, tore off the device and declared, quote, with horrid oaths that he would stew the said pew with the guts and bowels of those who should dare to oppose his sitting in said pew, unquote. Nim persisted in sitting where he wished, and a few Sundays later, the 3 youths arrived at the Litchfield Church early to stop him. But Nim was already there, peacefully sitting in his pew. The boys entered the pew and forcefully threw him out. Some church members defended the boys' violence, though others were appalled by such, quote, rude, profane, and unlawful behavior in church. Therefore, 2 months later, the youths were taken to court to account for their assaults. Unsurprisingly, the case was resolved in the white youth's favor. Enslaved people's Christian practice could be further undermined because of their enslaved status. While records about the lives of the enslaved at First Church in Roxbury are exceedingly sparse, Couture's experience shines some light on such obstruction. In 1756, Couture, a Black woman enslaved by First Church member Thomas Seaver, quote, desired to give herself to God in baptism, unquote. Seaver did not object. Still, Couture faced difficulty because her husband's enslaver, in violation of Massachusetts law, forbade them from marrying. Couture and her husband thus lived together as if they were husband and wife for 12 years and birthed at least 2 children, Phoebe and Susanna, both enslaved by Seaver. They were technically living together, without being formally married, which was in contravention of church principles. But Couture argued her case well, providing First Church with a precedent for someone in her situation who was baptized at another church. She also recruited Seaver to, quote, attest to her good behavior, unquote. The matter was then left to the church membership to decide. At its next meeting, the church deferred their decision to inquire whether, quote, due application was made to the master of the Negro man for liberty to marry before they lived together as husband and wife, unquote. Presumably, the church found that Keturah requested permission to marry her partner before they began living together because the congregation voted to allow Keturah's baptism to proceed. On September 12th, 1756, Keturah and her 2 daughters were baptized at the First Church in Roxbury. Enslaved people at the First Church in Roxbury, as we've already seen, resisted in many different ways. After attending a nighttime revel hosted by a white First Church member named Sarah Cleaves, an enslaved Black woman named Maria used hot coal to set ablaze the homes of 2 First Church in Roxbury members, Dr. Thomas Swan and her enslaver, Joshua Lamb. One girl, the church scribe recorded, quote, was burned and all the rest had much ado to escape with their lives, unquote. Maria pleaded guilty and was sentenced to be burned to death by the governor of Massachusetts. On September 22nd, 1681, Maria was executed at the gallows in Boston Neck along with 2 men, quote, an Englishman for rape and a Negro man for burning a house at Northampton, unquote. As Increase Mather, reverend and father of famed minister Cotton Mather, recorded in his diary. When the Englishman arrived at the gallows, Cotton Mather wrote that the condemned man saw, quote, death and a picture of hell, too, in a Negro then burnt to death at the stake for burning her master's house with some that were in it, unquote. Unlike Maria, neither man was burned alive. In her confession, Maria implicated 2 other enslaved people in the fires. Shephelia, a Black man enslaved by a Mr. Walker of Boston, and Cuffy, a Black man enslaved by one James Pemberton. The grand jury, however, did not find sufficient evidence to indict them. Nevertheless, fearful of slave rebellion and with little regard for justice or Black lives, the court ordered that Shephelia and Cuffy be sold out of New England. Historian Kaylee Nicole Gross provides crucial context to Maria's story. While popular memory about women burned at the stake conjures images of 17th century white women burned to death for witchcraft, in fact, these women and girls were hanged. Women were indeed burned at the stake during this period. However, most of them were not white, but Black. Maria was the first woman to be burned at the stake in the 13 mainland colonies and one of 2 women in colonial Massachusetts, both of whom were enslaved Black women. Beginning with Maria's death and ending with the last known woman burned at the stake, a Black woman in North Carolina in 1805, the overwhelming majority, 87%, were Black. Black women convicted of arson or murder faced harsher punishments than their white counterparts. And as Gross explains, Maria's case highlights other ominous legacies. Throughout much of the nation's history, Black women constituted the lion's share of female death penalty cases, especially during and after the Civil War. Maria's case is little known, and there is so much about Maria that we do not know. Where was she from? Did she have a family? How old was she? Why did she set the houses on fire? In this way, Gross explains, Maria's story is, quote, an apt metaphor for the treatment of Black women in the historical record, illustrating a dynamic as tragic as it is timeless. Back then, white people didn't bother to document the lives of Black women. Today, as evidenced by aggressive efforts to restrict the teaching of the United States' racial history, many white people want even the limited remnants buried. Gross continues, quote, if we are to effectively work towards equal justice in this country, we must know this history and understand its impact on Black women's lives. In the present, we cannot allow racist tyranny to silence the past. These testimonies exist. We must hear them.
Thank you, Aabid, for bringing this report to life in really difficult and important ways. We're going to pause and take a few minutes to respond to some of the questions in the question and answer box. And then we'll do this for a few minutes, and then Aabid will continue his report. So welcome back also, Byron. So our first question is from Susan. That says, history knows from the journal kept by Governor John Winthrop of the Massachusetts Bay Colony that some Pequot captives after the Pequot War, so-called, in 1637 were given to prominent colonists as servants, and some were sent to the West Indies. Did any records connect any of the people in this report to the Pequot War or to King Philip's War in 1635 or so?
The answer is yes. So if you go to the report, the introduction has a table, and there is at least 4 to 5 Indigenous people who were enslaved, and they were enslaved during both the Pequot War and then later during King Philip's War. And they were one of these enslaved Indigenous people was enslaved by the inaugural pastor of the First Church of Roxbury, Pastor Thomas Weld. And that wasn't uncommon. Pastors, ministers, reverends enslaved many people. It was very common in New England, unfortunately.
I think it's also at this point, the reference that you make to the first Africans coming to Boston, probably Massachusetts, is of course from what Winthrop entitled his journal, The History of New England, which was sort of, and it comes from just 2 references. He has one reference of the ship, the Desire, leaving, and it left with enslaved Indigenous people. Who most and who had fought in the Pequot War. And then when the next reference is on the Desire coming back, which is the next year, and on it are the Africans. He doesn't name any of them, so we from his record we have no names of the 17 Indigenous people who were sent, as he said, and none of the Africans who were brought. He didn't give the census for the Africans who were brought. So we don't know how many Africans were on the ship. The general evidence, most historians just assume that the next time you hear about a Black person in Massachusetts, they must have been on that 1637, 1638 round trip of enslaved people.
There's a number of more questions coming in. This one's from Samantha. Do you know if mixed race couples of the same era are recorded in other colonies?
Yeah, so there were mixed race couples in, wherever there were, more than one race of people living together, there were mixed race couples. So you'll find a lot of people like the Bedunias, even in places like 18th century Massachusetts, where interracial marriage and interracial relationships of any kind were illegal. So the answer is yes, unequivocally yes.
From Barbara, what denominations were housed as First Church over the years in First Church Roxbury?
Do you want to answer that? I love to answer it.
I would love for you to answer
that. Everybody's smiling because I think I've found out, because of this research of doing it and trying to figure out what on all of these lists, how the people are described in reference to the church. I have, I think, found out more about Puritans than I've ever thought I'd learn. And essentially, there's only one denomination that but the denomination changed. So so the people who founded the church, like the people who founded Boston, were Puritans, and they had, so that was the congregation, the original congregation, and they changed their name, but they did not change their denomination. They became Congregationalists. And then the Congregationalists, after the American Revolution in the early 19th century, around 1820, had a huge, big theological fight. And there are a number of aspects of that, but probably the most famous, the most well-known, is over Unitarianism or Trinitarianism. And the Puritans, many Puritans had been easing into Unitarianism, and before it gave it a name. Then they give it a name, and then people want to separate on that basis. And the congregation, since they were all Democratic, all the Puritan congregations in Massachusetts voted on it. And if you won, you got the building. And if you lost, you had to go and that separated congregation then had to, in terms of buildings, start from scratch. In Roxbury, the Unitarians win. That's why this remained a Unitarian church until the congregation went out of existence. And the church that the Congregationalists set up, they first set up in a building about no more than 2 blocks away from John Elliott Square. And then when they became prosperous, they built a church which they, of course, because you have to, what are sort of, how do they describe themselves and be original? They named their church after Eliot. So that's Eliot Congregational Church up on Walnut Avenue. That's where they come from.
Thank you, Byron. There's a few more questions, but I think we're going to hold them until the end so that Aabid can continue his report. So I'm going to turn it back over to you, Aabid.
Thank you. Let's see. Okay, I think folks can see my screen again. Okay, so family separation. The enslaved at First Church in Roxbury were separated from their families often several times throughout their lives. In addition to buying and selling human beings, some First Church enslavers tore apart families by giving away Black babies and little children. First Church member John Greeton, for instance, advertised, quote, "a Negro male child of an excellent breed to be given away," unquote. An announcement a short time later was presumably Greeton again, marketing the same child, quote, "to be given away, a likely Negro male child born and still at Roxbury," unquote. Greeton's actions were not uncommon. Indeed, enslaved children in New England were often given away by enslavers. To give just a few of countless examples from colonial Boston newspapers, quote, "a very likely female Negro child to be given away," unquote. Another, quote, "a Negro child a few days old to be given away," unquote. As Massachusetts Historical Society Jeremy Belknap stated in 1795, Black children were, quote, "given away like puppies," unquote. Sylvanus Warrow was born to Jacob and Maria Warrow in Maryland around 1645. The Warrows were enslaved by Daniel Gookin, who lived in Virginia and Maryland before removing to Massachusetts, where for 3 years he lived in Roxbury. Sylvanus and his brother Daniel arrived in New England without their parents, one of whom, Jacob, was killed in an Indian raid on Gookin's Maryland plantation. Sylvanus Worrow was a rebellious person who found himself in court on multiple occasions. Throughout his life, perhaps Worrow's constant resistance is why in 1667, Gookin hired him out to First Church of Roxbury member William Park for 8 years with a promise of freedom after the term expired. The promise of freedom at some future date was a strategy enslavers occasionally employed to convince rebellious slaves to comply with their wishes. In 1672, Worrow was convicted of theft, forging a key to Park's safe and stealing from it, for which Park was awarded a 20-pound judgment. It was the following charge, however, that would have the greatest impact on Worrow's life. Worrow impregnated one of William Park's white servants, First Church parishioner Elizabeth Parker, and was ordered to pay child support of 2 shillings 6 pence per week for the baby they conceived out of wedlock. Should he fail to do so, the court decreed, he would be sold. But Park no longer wanted Worrow in his household, and Worrow was not provided an opportunity to earn any money. Thus, the new father was to be sold back into slavery, his contract for future freedom negated. Gookin not only harbored no qualms about Worrow's re-enslavement, but also offered to sell Worrow to Virginia away from the life he had built in Massachusetts. Park, however, found a local buyer, one Jonathan Wade of Medford. Gookin subsequently visited Worrow in jail and provided him some advice. He should accept his fate and perhaps, quote, he might fall in with Mr. Wade's Negro wench and live well, unquote. Gookin kept in touch with Worrow and occasionally hired him from Wade when he and his family needed assistance. For example, Gookin requested Worrow's services in 1680 after Gookin's daughter's marriage because Miss Gookin knew Worrow, quote, to be handy, unquote. In 1682, however, Gookin went behind Wade's back, calling Worrow to his residence without Wade's permission. Gookin drew up a contract which Worrow signed, declaring Worrow and his offspring to be Gookin's slaves. While Worrow would still be enslaved, the agreement would permit him to live among his family. A furious Wade sued Gookin for stealing his human property and won. Worrow would stay enslaved in Wade's household. Elizabeth Parker was removed from Park's household after giving birth and sent to live with her father Edmund in Lancaster. Parker did not consider her relationship with Worrow shameful because he was Black. Indeed, she named her son Sylvanus Worrow after his father, shining an even brighter light on her former partners and son's racial identities. Edmund, for his part, welcomed his multiracial grandson into his home and even successfully fought William Park and multiple county courts after they undertook to remove his grandchild from his home and bind him out to service. Sylvanus Sr. refused to fulfill Gookin's wish that he, quote, fall in with Mr. Wade's Negro wench, unquote. In 1709, his son Sylvanus Jr. learned that he had a half-sister enslaved by John Wade, the product of a relationship his father had with another white woman, and was determined to, quote, get her free, unquote. Sylvanus Jr.'s half-sister, whose name remains unknown, should never have been enslaved because by law she took the status of her mother, who was free. Still, in a place and time when nearly all whites had no misgivings about racial chattel slavery, Sylvanus Jr. was unable to free his half-sister. Native war captives. On July 30th, 1640, in the Court of Assistance, quote, 2 Indian women were adjudged to be whipped for their insolent behavior and for abusing Mrs. Weld, unquote, the wife of First Church in Roxbury pastor Thomas Weld. One of these may have been Nan, quote, Mr. Weld's captive Indian, as the church described her, enslaved during the Pequot War of 1636 to 1638. Presumably, the other Indian woman was also taken captive in the war and at the time of her supposed, quote, insolent behavior, unquote, was likely enslaved by Pastor Weld or another First Church congregant. While First Church recorded Nan's death in its records, she was not a member. The Roxbury Church neither baptized nor admitted into membership any Indian in the colonial period. The day after Nan died, Esben, another Pequot War captive enslaved by an unspecified First Church parishioner, quote, having lived 10 years among the English, could read and desire to know God, unquote, passed away. British colonists, however, began enslaving Indians long before the Pequot War. In fact, the English enslaved Indians from the coastal settlements in the early 17th century, well before they established any colonies in the New England region. The war did, however, intensify English slaving considerably. As Margaret Newell has written, although the Pequot War began for a variety of strategic and economic reasons, for the English and their Native American allies, it quickly became a conflict whose purpose was securing captives. The English in New England made a conscious decision to enslave Pequots. No First Church member and few English overall protested the mass enslavement of the Pequot. The only New Englanders who protested Pequot enslavement were Indians themselves, the Pequot as well as English allied Indians who attempted to convince the English to spare non-combatants and Pequot soldiers who surrendered peacefully from execution or chattel slavery. Despite these protests, the English enslaved hundreds of Pequot, many of whom they sold overseas. Several captives were sold into slavery in Bermuda in return for a number of goods, including other human beings, who became some of the first enslaved Africans in New England. The first Bible printed in North America. In 1663, the first Bible was printed in North America. The Bible was not printed in English or any other European language, but in Algonquian. Many historians have previously claimed that First Church and Roxbury missioner John Eliot achieved this feat alone. But as Eliot himself noted, he was reliant upon Indian translators, interpreters, and teachers to produce the Algonquian Bible and the rest of his so-called Indian library. Early in his translation efforts, Eliot wrote Edward Winslow of Plymouth, quote, I have yet but little skill in their language. I must have some Indians, and there may be other help continually about me to try and examine translations, unquote. Cockanoe, a Montaukett from Long Island, was central to Eliot's translations. He was about 13 years old when taken captive during the Pequot War while visiting Pequot relatives. The English enslaved him even though neither he nor his tribe had done any harm to them. Cockanoe, whose name signified teacher or one with knowledge, swiftly obtained a strong grasp of English and the local Wampanoag, Massachusetts dialects. Richard Calico, a leader of the English forces, enslaved him for 11 years, and for some of that time, Cockanoe served as Eliot's teacher, translator, and interpreter. Eliot was impressed by Cockanoe. Quote, this Indian is ingenious, can read, and I taught him to write, which he quickly learned. He was the first that I made use of to teach me words and to be my interpreter. Just to repeat what Eliot said, Cockanoe was the first that I made use of to teach me words and to be my interpreter. Eliot hoped Cockanoe would become the first Indigenous member of his enslavers' church in Dorchester and use his command of multiple languages to advance the gospel. But Cockanoe had other plans, leaving Eliot utterly disappointed. The accomplished teacher chose to return to a leadership role in Indigenous communities. He enjoyed a 40-year career as an interpreter for Native and English clients in Long Island and Connecticut, and became a close advisor and brother-in-law of the Montaukett Sachem Wyandotte. Eliot then looked to John Sassamon, a native servant, for assistance. During the Pequot War, Sassamon served as an interpreter and fought for the English. He was a servant in the household of Richard Calico, who enslaved Cockanoe. Sassamon likely attended the Indian school in Dorchester. Eliot, who lived close by, often visited the town and taught at the school, which is how he became familiar with and impressed by Sassamon's ability. Indeed, it may have been Cockanoe and Sassamon that made John Eliot determined to convert Indians. Sassamon studied at Harvard for a few months in 1753 alongside students such as Increase Mather, and later served as a scribe and interpreter for multiple sachems, including Metacom or Philip, until their relationship soured. In 1675, Sassamon was killed. The English accused 3 of Metacom's men of murder, and on flimsy evidence had them tried, convicted, and hanged. Shortly thereafter began King Philip's War, in which at least 3 indigenous people were taken captive and enslaved by members of the First Church in Roxbury. Quote, an Indian boy of Holbrook's, an Indian girl of Mr. Dudley, unquote, and a man named Peter. Other Indians vital to the Bible translation project included Job Nesutan, who Eliot's associate Daniel Gookin described as, quote, a very good linguist in the English tongue, and was Mr. Eliot's assistant and interpreter in his translation of the Bible and other books of the Indian language, unquote. And Wawas recruited by Eliot to be a printer and thereafter known as James Printer. Printer was one of the only people in New England to be familiar with both the Algonquian language and its printing in English type. Eliot himself observed in 1683 that, quote, we have but one man, viz. The Indian printer, that is able to compose these sheets and correct the press with understanding, unquote. To borrow Lisa Brooks's words, scholars like Cockenoe, John Sassamon, and Job Nesutan and Wawas, or James Printer, were not merely students who received or were subjected to a colonial education, but significant contributors to the emergence of a multilingual American literary tradition, beginning with the indigenous language publications of Harvard Press, which was housed in the Indian College at Harvard University. Until their life histories are fully told and embedded into larger narratives of colonial New England, our understanding of the past and present will not only be incomplete, but crucially flawed. Thank you.
Thank you, Aabid, again, for bringing all this to life, all the information in your report. I know we were scheduled to end at 7. I wonder if you can go until maybe just 7:10 to answer a few questions.
That's fine.
Okay, so we'll just go till 7:10, and then any questions that we haven't been able to get to, we will see if Byron and Aabid can answer some of them, and we'll post them on our website, which is www.uuum.org. So we'll get through a few of these. I'm going to try to consolidate a few, and then whatever we don't get to, we'll try to post. So one of the questions I wanted to ask, which is asked in a variety of ways by folks, is from Jennifer, says, thank you so much for the presentation. Could you talk a little bit about your research process and specifically where you found the names recorded? Looking at your bibliography, it seems like the important primary sources included the record books of the First Church, as well as tax, probate, and court records.
Sure. So thank you for that question. I think for the most part, the question hit it on the head. It was mostly primary sources, the First Church records, some of which are transcribed, but the full set of church records are at the Harvard Divinity School archives. Then the Suffolk County court records, and those are digitized, most of them, and they're housed at the Massachusetts State Archives. Then you have the tax records, and those are also part of the Massachusetts State Archives. They're digitized, and a version of them are printed out, the 1771 tax records, that is. So primary sources like those, and then there's also, good secondary research done on slavery in Roxbury. So there is the 11 Names Project by Wayne Tucker. In the report, there's a little bit about the Dudleys. I didn't speak about the Dudleys today for lack of time, and also because if you go to the 11 Names Project, you can find a lot more about the Dudleys and their involvement in slavery. And a second good source that I drew on for both my report and for this presentation is a dissertation on by a professor, then student, now professor, named Gloria Whiting. And she has a dissertation on African families in New England with a focus on the greater Boston area. And one of the families, she focuses primarily on the colonial period. So one of the families she focuses on is the Bedunia family. So that's also a very helpful source that you know, I learned a lot from, and that provided a good resource for the report.
Yeah, I would just like to add to that 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 these records are there. You know, just far more records of enslavement in the United States are there than people want to admit. And unfortunately, why the digging that Aabid had to do has to be so granular is that so much of those records that are in institutions are not cataloged. And so you have to, and I think a similar thing is happening on what gets chosen to digitize now. Is that the white records get digitized first, you know, and they'll tell you they're not doing that, right? And so I think it's important to understand that it is for doing any of this research is going to be a lot of digging, but you shouldn't start off assuming you're not going to find things. You are going to find things. Like the plans of the present building of First Church. I mean, it's just remarkable, and it was never hidden. It was just never cataloged, right? Yeah.
Yep. One question from Philip is, were there any people who spoke out against the racist laws being passed or slavery, or was there even any debate?
So for the 17th century, the answer, if you're talking about white people in the 17th century, the answer is almost no one. In the report, I do go through, so one of the only people in the greater Boston area and Massachusetts and New England more generally that kind of spoke out against slavery was John Eliot, but this was more not because it was, you know, morally wrong. He was by no means an abolitionist, but it was more for practical reasons because that had to do with the wars that the colonists were fighting against Indigenous people in the area. And Eliot thought that this would, you know, enslaving Indigenous peoples would turn them away from Christianity. And so really in the 17th century and for most of the 18th century, the only people who were anti-slavery were African descended people and Indigenous peoples in the region, enslaved people themselves, but also free African and Indigenous people. That starts to pick up a little bit in the Revolutionary era, but the main kind of drivers of abolition in the colonial period, including the Revolutionary era, in the 17th century are Indigenous folks, and then in the 18th century are Black folks.
There are so for New England, probably the big exception is Samuel Sewall, the selling of Joseph, which is probably the first oldest thesis by a Puritan opposed to slavery, which seems to have been just almost completely ignored. So most references that you see to it are references that are made to it 50 and 60 years after it was published. And people would then make a reference. When abolitionism was becoming more popular among white people, there would be references to this early source, right?
Thank you. One question from Nanny, and then we're going to wind up shortly. I've noticed in my research, she writes, and in reading that 17th and 18th century ministers in Massachusetts often owned a slave or slaves. Why?
So the short answer is that, it was not in opposition to Christianity as they interpreted it. There's a longer answer. There are longer answers, but for now, I guess we can just settle on that because of time. Though, in later in the in the 17th, 18th century and thereafter, Christianity is used by enslaved people and free white people, some free white people, to make abolitionist and anti-slavery arguments. Though the religion is also used to make pro-slavery arguments.
Yeah, I think that I think that's absolutely right, and I think it's hard for us to believe just how common this was and how white people thought this was. There was no objection to it. That's why I always find the ads for giving away children so remarkable. So people, so there's just no feeling that this should be some kind of private thing, that I'm going to give away this baby. You could advertise it in the newspaper, and that shows you just how slavery was considered to be just the way things were done. That the treatment of slaves, enslaved people in this country, got to the point where it was just no significant difference between that and the treatment of animals. In the South, if you wanted to find a list of all of the enslaved people on a plantation, you would go to the list of all the farm animals, and that's where Jefferson kept his list, and so the idea that they were property was just central to their understanding of people that were different than they were.
Thank you.
And Matha got his first enslaved person from his congregation. His congregation decided after he had been there a year, they should give him an enslaved person, right? Yeah.
So we have a number of very good questions. We're going to take these. We're going to see if we can, if Byron and Aabid can give us some answers, some short answers, and post them on our website. But I want to end with a question that actually Aabid, Byron, and I talked about briefly before we came on the webinar, and this is from Jerry. It says, this research is so interesting and so important. Please say more about the plan for what happens next after this report.
Well, I think we are certainly going to attempt to keep everybody who's doing this work talking to each other. And so I think we're looking for the best way to have a connection with all the people who are interested, and interested in doing the work. And so we're going to figure that out. There are other groups of researchers that are together and talking about this, like the Atlantic Black Box, and so I think that that's the step we want to take. If you don't want to do the research, there's an important thing that you can do, and that is, if you have any connection to any institution in Massachusetts that has colonial origins, you should just work to get them to do this work. And of course, some of them, of course, have done this work and won't publish it. We made a decision, and UUUM agreed immediately that what Aabid found would not, there would be no barrier to getting hold of it. You can go on the website of UUUM and get the whole report, and that's the way. And that's the way these things should be happening.
And the other thing, did you want to say something, Aabid, before I?
Oh, I was just going to say that, yeah, I just hope that it can, folks locally that have been doing this work for years and years can, can use this report in any way they can, or they, rather than us kind of imposing on our views on folks that have already been doing this work.
One of, and one thing that I wanted to say is that for the piece of the work that Aabid has completed relative to First Church, we are thinking as an organization at the Urban Ministry about how this should be interpreted, how it should be shared, whether it should be signage, what that should look like. And we really, in particular, want our Roxbury neighbors to weigh in on that. And so I would ask that you please let me know if you're interested. We're going to create a committee of people to think about how do we advance this work and how do we interpret and hold it up. So please let me know. My name and my email are on our website as well. This recording will also be posted on the Urban Ministries website. And I just want to thank everybody. We had many participants watching this evening. I'm glad for people to want to know this. It's overdue and important. I want to thank Aabid so much for he has gone over and above in sharing his scholarly work, his time, his interest. I want to thank Byron for persevering and lifting up and always trying to get people to do this important work. We're really proud to partner with Byron and the Roxbury Historical Society and really grateful for Aabid. So thank you both. And thank you everyone for being here this evening. And we will continue to look into this past in order to do the work that we need to do to make this present day more fair and just. So thank you, everybody.